This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Welcome back, folks, to another episode of the Human Action Podcast. Before we dive into my analysis of Randall Wray, listen to this announcement. Join us May 15th through 17th at the Mises Institute for our Revisionist History of War Conference. For the ruling classes, war is an opportunity. For the citizens, war means death or crippling injury, taxes, debt, sacrifice, and loss of freedoms. Never is the state's bamboozling and lying more extreme than when the subject is war, for war is the very health of the state. But it's not true that the victors always write history. We can write the history of war too, and that's exactly what we are going to do with our first history conference in almost 30 years. Join us as we host an exciting lineup of Misesian and Rothbardian speakers who will illustrate for us and the world just why so many learned commentators have expressed the conviction that lies and propaganda are an essential ingredient of war. Member registration is $300 and non-member registration is $325. Register now at Mises.org/RHW. Again, register now at Mises.org/RHW. Welcome back to the Human Action Podcast, everybody. As I've been promising over the last couple episodes, we're doing a three-peat for MMT analysis. In today's episode, I am going to grab some excerpts from a lecture that Randall Wray, one of the leading academics behind the modern MMT movement, he gave it I believe it was in an undergrad institution somewhere. He's clearly giving a talk to, a class. And because I think it's very illustrative of what I believe are the extreme weaknesses of MMT. All right. So there was a lot I could have focused on. I'm going to center on MMT's faulty historical analysis. All right. So the big picture is, besides the MMTers saying, hey, we're just describing how the world works, you Austrians are ideologues living in fantasy land. Besides that element, a typical move is they'll say, look, at the MMT approach is consistent with the historical record, and in particular, like the archaeological findings and what guys like David Graeber have dug up about how money was used in ancient civilizations. The MMTers can explain that. You Austrians, with your discredited notion of, well, first there was barter and then money emerged spontaneously as a medium of exchange. That's crazy, guys, right? That's what they say. So I'm not going to focus on that particular part of the MMT Austrian clash, because that's what Jonathan Newman and I talked about last episode here on this podcast. But what I'm going to focus on in this one is for more recent history. Right? So there's two historical episodes. But before we dive into that, let me just jump ahead in the Randall Wray talk to show. So he gives his prepared lecture. He's got a PowerPoint show and everything. And then at the end, he opens it up to questions and answers. By the way, if you click on the video, which of course I'll give you the link in the show notes page here, folks, I think probably for like privacy reasons, you can't hear the questions. Like, it's clearly an edited video, and Ray at the end of this talk, the camera's just on him. You can't see who the audience is, and he's clearly responding to questions, but you don't hear the questions. So I think they did that just for privacy reasons. But in any event, at the end, there's some key statements he makes that to me just epitomize what's going on here, right? Why is it that we Austrians and those MMTers have such fundamental disagreements? It's partly because we have such different views about the role that government plays in the economy. And so that's partly why I think it's refreshing that we're not beating around the bush here. Austrians, at least modern Austro-libertarian types, of course, are very much not fans of government intervention in the economy, and the MMTers, it's the other way around. And I will show you here, as this clip is about to demonstrate, that Randall Wray just accepts that head on, and that he thinks that's a weakness of the way economics is taught. So let me just go ahead and play this particular clip.
We actually were going to subtitle ours, we're not doing it, a government-centered approach, because every other textbook, the government comes in chapter 10, right? And you say, that's pretty bizarre, because the government is by far the biggest entity in the economy. By far, nothing comes close to the size of the government, okay? And the government is the issuer of the currency. And you wait till chapter 10 to tell the students, oh, by the way, there's this thing called government too. Okay, that is very bizarre. Of course you should start with the government. It's got to be there in chapter 1. It's the most important thing about our economy. Okay? And although everyone said, well, but now we're a free market capitalist economy. The governments of capitalist economies tend to be much bigger than the governments of pre-capitalist economies. Okay? Capitalist economies need big governments. It tends to be true that as you go down, when you rank countries by size of government, as you go down, when you get to the ones with governments smaller than ours, they do not work well. So Mexico has a government that's about 13% of the economy. Is Mexico a more successful economy than the United States, which has a federal government about 20 to 25% of the economy? Okay? Almost twice as big. No. France has a government that's 50% of the economy. France used to work pretty well before they gave up their currency. So anyway, the governments of capitalist economies are big, and there's a reason for it.
Okay, let me also, before diving into the historical stuff, which is going to form the backbone of today's episode, let me deal with another sort of quick hit that I can do, because again, this was near the end of his talk, and he didn't actually go through the whole laborious exposition to get the students to understand why he was making these claims, but he did make the claim, and I'm just going to refute it empirically, right? And so specifically, let me go ahead and play the clip for you.
Oh, everything I said about modern money theory applies to every country in the world that issues its own currency and doesn't peg its exchange rate. Everything I just said applies to them too. Virtually every country in the world has a big government debt. Ours is not big relative to many other countries in the world. Okay, Japan's was 3 times bigger. Ours is growing maybe 2.5 times bigger than ours relative to the size of the economy. Ours is not big. Americans have this conception we have a big government debt, but it's not true. It's because the media and Republicans harp on this all the time, but it's just not true. Okay, so why don't we do more? I think is the right question. All of us should do more. The countries that don't have big government debts and budget deficits are exporting countries. Exporters can get away without government deficits. The reason is because they get their demand from other countries. So China, their central government can run a balanced budget. Okay, Singapore can run a budget surplus because their demand comes from abroad. Okay, and that keeps their economy growing even though their government is actually draining the economy. So that is the only exception. If you are a current account surplus country, you don't need a budget deficit. But all other countries have them.
All right. And so what he's alluding to there is what's called the sectoral balance approach. And I have dealt with that many times in various outlets associated with the Mises Institute, both talks I've given, articles I've written for Mises.org, my review of Stephanie Kelton's book. I've had this stuff in numerous times. So big picture, the MMTers think that it's just a matter of sheer accounting, that you can show by necessity if you want the private sector to accumulate net financial assets, the only way that's possible is if your country is either running a surplus of exports, right? So it's a net exporter balance, or if the government of your country is running a budget deficit. And the way, and so when you write the equations out and define the terms the way they define them, yeah, those are true statements, but it leads you to believe, like for example, what I just played in that clip there, it leads you to believe that, if you're in a country and you don't have more exports than imports, if you just have balanced trade, or even worse yet, if you are running a trade deficit, then you absolutely need your country's government to run a budget deficit. Otherwise, you can't grow, right? I mean, he clearly said words to that effect in that clip I just played for you. And that is simply not true. Okay? That the mistake is how they're defining their terms, or the where the misleading element comes in is, strictly speaking, if you do the accounting, it works out that the only way that private investment, if you want private saving to exceed private investment, the only way that's possible is if you either have a surplus of exports over imports, or the government's running a budget deficit. Right. And so just the export one's a little trickier to picture for the layperson, but just focus on the budget deficit one. That if the government is running a budget deficit, then people in the private sector are lending money to the government that's not taxed away from them. So they're accumulating bonds on net. Right. And so some element of private saving is being siphoned away, is not being diverted into private investment, but is instead being lent to the government. Right. So that's how it's possible that saving could exceed private saving could exceed domestic private investment. And that's what they're calling net financial investment, or net financial saving, excuse me. All right. And that's why their net assets are going up in that model. Okay. But so what? That part of the critique from not just Austrians, but free market types in general, if you say, what's the problem with excessive government budget deficits? A standard textbook response would be, oh, it can crowd out private investment, right? That phrase, crowding out, is something that the MMTers laugh at and think that that's arcane. But that's a standard thing economists would say. And so that is exactly illustrated in the very accounting tautologies that the MMTers appeal to when they're running victory laps. That their own equations, their own framework shows if the government runs a budget deficit, then the way that the equations still balance is that private saving then has to be higher than private investment. And that excess is, going into the, and that's also why, in case you care, like how the international trade can work too, right? If you're selling more stuff to foreigners than they're selling to you, well, then it's like, what are you getting in exchange for sending them goodies? Oh, you could be investing in their assets, right? If we're selling more wheat to some country than we're buying of their cars, why would we be doing that? Well, they must be giving us something. So we're getting more net ownership in their financial sector or real estate or something over there, right? So that kind of helps explain. So again, if Americans were saving more than they were investing in U.S. assets, then how could you explain that in terms of international trade? Oh, if we had a trade surplus, if we were exporting more than we were importing, right? So that's the way these things work. But again, that doesn't mean, right? So the issue is, oh, well, what if your country is saving a bunch and you have a balanced international trade and your government, is running a balanced budget? What are you going to do with all that excess saving? You can invest more domestically, and that makes all the equations balance, right? So again, the point, and that's not like a consolation prize. If you think private investment is more productive than government deficit spending, well, then there you go. That's a good thing. So my point is just the crowding out story of conventional gold bug type economists that the MMTers mock is perfectly consistent with the macro national income accounting tautologies that the MMTers like to throw around to try to show that, hey, we're just doing accounting here. This is just math. Okay. So again, that's the framework that, to underline what Ray's excerpt there that I just played for you, what he's getting at. But beyond that, he said more. He then went on to say that, we just know empirically that the economies economies where government spending is not a big share, they tended to be smaller, right? So he was trying to just appeal empirically to this correlation between, the bigger the government, it tends to be a richer economy or more productive economy. And I know there's plenty of empirical evidence to show that on broad measures of what's called economic freedom, that is not the case. Okay, so it's not purely just looking at the size of government as a share of GDP. It includes other things like regulatory certainty, rule of law, things like that. But the size of government is one of the criteria in these measures, like the Cato Institute puts them out. I think the Heritage Foundation, that they're called, they rank countries on the score of economic freedom. They call them the Economic Freedom Index. And then some groups also even just do like a U.S. state ranking. And they might even have Canadian provinces. I'm not sure about that. Okay. So, and I've worked, this is years ago at this point, so the details I'm rusty on, but they're not arguing in a circle, all right, that they want these things to be rigorous. The idea was to have a set of criteria by which we could objectively say, yes, this jurisdiction has more or less economic freedom, and you could come up with a way to quantify that. I mean, there's some arbitrariness in the specific quantification, but the point is you could come up with objectively ascertainable measures, and then you want to relate those independent variables to the dependent variable of like GDP growth or just the level of real GDP or the unemployment rate or even things like literacy and infant mortality, stuff like that. Okay, environmental quality, you can come up with some index. Okay, and again, so my point is when they constructed those things, those indices, they were careful to not just be arguing in a circle, right? So they didn't want to just say, oh, rich economies are correlated with rich economies, like, because that would be, so the Economic Freedom Index per se is not saying, oh, the richer you are, the freer you are, because that would be arguing in a circle. So no, they are independent measures where there's a clearly independent variable and a defined or a dependent variable or variables, and then they can do a regression analysis. So I will link in the show notes page with Lawrence McQuillan. Years ago, we did a review of this literature, and just because there's been tons and tons of peer-reviewed articles that once these various organizations had published, and they update them annually, their economic freedom index ranking of the world with objective quantifiable scores, right? It's not just a ranking of first, second, third. They also give actual scores so you can plug them into a regression analysis over the course of years. And so you can go ahead and do stuff like that and get analysis and see, like, other things equal, the higher you rank on your economic freedom index, GDP growth is higher by such and such, right? They can do stuff like that, or they can just say, oh, if you look at the top quintile of countries ranked by economic freedom, then you can see how, they have this much share of global income, those sorts of things. And it's pretty robust. And these are not little anecdotal looking at one country over a 2-year time period or something. It is dozens, like a lot of these studies, it's dozens and dozens of countries over the span of decades. And they throw them in these analyses, and the results are very robust in terms of what you would expect to see if you're generally a fan of capitalism and free markets, that regions that have a higher ranking on economic freedom do better economically. Okay. And so again, this Randall Wray, he can come up with one-off anecdotes, and it's also not surprising too that a like backward country that doesn't have robust institutions, period, might also not have a very efficient, organized central government. So it's not surprising if you look at some what we would consider to be backward country that has a low standard of living, they also might not have this huge, robust government that has all kinds of highway spending and large-scale Social Security programs and things. But in general, you take two first world countries and you tell me one of them's got government share of GDP is 50% and the other one government share of GDP is 20%. and they have similar deficits and debt loads and things like that, and one of them has very minimal intervention in terms of labor markets and stuff like that. I'm going to be pretty confident that the one with the lower share of government and lighter regulation in labor markets is going to have better scores in terms of GDP growth, the absolute standard of living, the average unemployment rate, stuff like that. And that's what the data tend to support. So again, Ray's there. I'm saying it's a twofold. Like theoretically, what they're trying to get you to believe with their appeal to the income tautologies or accounting tautologies is incorrect. As I argued, it's consistent with the standard crowding out story. And also just the loose appeal to empirical reality is also incorrect. That I know I can produce tons of empirical studies. And also too, we can do the anecdotes, right? North Korea versus South Korea, East Germany versus West Germany. It's pretty clear cut in those cases when you have, quote, bigger government. What does that do to your economic performance? Okay. Let's now play a clip. Ray is quite adamant here that money is always related to debt. So I'm going to go ahead and play that clip.
Fiat money is not worthless. It's valuable due to the state's promise to redeem it in payments to the state. You can find this in the economic literature. The very best place to start is with A. Mitchell Innes, who was the Queen's ambassador to Washington. He was an autodidactic. He wrote something on beekeeping, and then he wrote the 2 best articles ever written on money. Okay. How he figured it out, I have no idea. Keynes reviewed it and said, we might quibble with some of the details, but the argument is sound. Okay. Money and debt are linked. Debts are denominated in the state money of account. My professor Minsky used to always say, anybody can create money. The problem is to get it accepted. Creating money is a matter of writing, I owe you $5. Your problem is to get somebody to accept that. Now, banks have an easy time. You have a harder time. All monies are created as liabilities of the issuers. And here's the key point that Innes makes. All issuers must accept their own liabilities back in payment. If you refuse to accept it, you have defaulted. Why was the Bank of England created? The king defaulted on his tally sticks. One of the King Georges, I don't remember which number. He defaulted on his tally sticks. So they had to create the Bank of England because nobody trusted that king anymore. Okay, he refused to accept back his own tally sticks in payment. All money is credit money. The state money approach might appear to be inconsistent with the credit money approach, but even state money is credit money. The state's money is the government's debt, the government's IOU, and they must accept it back in payment. Redemption then means delivering an IOU in payment to its issuer. All right? It doesn't matter whether the IOU is printed on a gold coin or printed on paper. It's an IOU. Okay? It doesn't need to have any intrinsic value or not, but even if it does, it is still an IOU. So sovereignty is a set of institutions. There are many other aspects of sovereignty, but the important one for money is that the sovereign has the power to impose fees, fines, taxes, and to name what it will accept in payment of those obligations to the state. When the fees, fines, and taxes are paid, the currency is redeemed. It's accepted back by the sovereign issuer. Some sovereigns also agree to redeem their IOUs for gold when you're on a gold standard, but that's not necessary. Now, we know it's not necessary, okay, because we gave it up a long time ago. Skip the rest of that. So, in almost all religions, debt is a sin, but being a creditor is an equal sin. Okay? So you're sinful on either side of the equation. The debts are paid by delivering back an IOU to the issuers. That is what we call redemption. These terms, of course, came from religion because money came out of the temples. So it's not a coincidence that many of the terms we use when we talk about money are terms we use when we talk about religion. So you can read this slide on your own. Which comes first, creation or redemption? Okay. You've got to create first before you can redeem. If you aren't in debt, you can't redeem yourself. Redemption can't come first. Debt has to come first. Government has to spend first, which is getting the government itself in debt, before the government can redeem itself, collect back in taxes. The colonial governments had to spend the notes before they can collect them. They have to be in sinful debt before they can be redeemed. This is true for everybody. Government, bank, household. You can't redeem your debts until you have created the debts.
Okay, so again, notice he didn't just say, oh, there tends to be this pattern. He was being pretty straightforward there that not by definition, but by its very nature, money is always a debt. And that is simply not true. All right, that obviously gold and silver, when they were the monies that the market produced, those are not in any way a debt. If you had a chunk of gold, whether it was just in raw form or if it had been stamped into coins, that's nobody's liability. There's nobody else in the economy that has issued that gold, and now that's a debit on their account and it's your credit and it sums to zero or something. That's not the way it works. All right. Bitcoin also, right? I'm not saying right now Bitcoin is money, but it could become one, right? It's theoretically possible if enough people started using it and embracing it. It could be a money, at least for a certain type of community. And clearly, Bitcoin is also not a liability to anybody. It's not a debt. Right? Ray anticipates that, and he says, "I'm not going to play it for you," but he does say during this talk that, "Oh, Bitcoin's not money," but he just says that and moves on. Okay, so there's that element. There's also the famous example, I refer to this a lot, of the POW camp in World War II. Right, there was a Royal Air Force pilot who had his day job before the war was a trained economist, and he got shot down, I think, and got captured by the Germans, and he's in this POW camp in World War II. And the rations that the Red Cross would give to the prisoners periodically would include cigarettes. And there were some prisoners who didn't smoke. So clearly what they would do when they get that, they would try to borrow them originally for other things that they might want. Oh, you got, your tin of ham there, and let me get that, and so on. All right. And it quickly developed inside this camp that the cigarettes became the money. And I reference that article a lot. If you've never read it, it's really a fascinating article. It's a lot more subtle than just what I've been saying. I mean, it was an interesting thing, just to give you an example, where they would have up on the chalkboard the day's prices, or maybe they updated it hourly or something. I don't remember. But, there were fluctuating prices based on supply and demand for various goods quoted in cigarettes. But what they found was, if somebody said, "Oh yeah, I'll sell you this thing, whatever it is, some my cookies or something, for 2 cigarettes," well, then somebody would have the incentive, because these were not the best constructed cigarettes either, that they could sort of, open it up and take a little of the tobacco out and then try to re-roll it and pass off an underweight cigarette. And so then, as Radford explains in the article, what quickly happened was the understanding evolved that everybody came to know that what we mean when we quote prices in terms of cigarettes is the amount of tobacco that would fill a standard, cigarette roll properly. That's what they meant when they said, "Oh, the cost of that is whatever, 1.5 cigarettes." It didn't mean you could give 1.5 really terrible dinky cigarettes where it's clear that somebody had emptied out half of the tobacco. That wouldn't count. That would not be a full-bodied cigarette. Okay, so really, even though we loosely speak and say it was cigarettes were trading as money or were used as money, it was really the tobacco that was. And it was just one standard cigarette's worth of tobacco was the unit of account in that POW economy. Okay, so why did I go on that tangent is to say there was no debt there, right? The cigarettes were money. They were the commonly accepted medium of exchange that emerged spontaneously according to the standard story that Austrians like to tell. It was like a laboratory experiment, as it were. And the cigarettes were not in any way a debt to anybody, nor were they foisted into circulation because the German guards were demanding periodic payment in terms of cigarettes. And so there was a tax. No, that wasn't involved either. Okay. So you've got all these different counterexamples, just again, showing that the MMTers, when they just make statements like that, like, oh yeah, all money is a debt, to just know that this is not true. You're ignoring all these counterexamples, and they have to either just literally ignore them or tie themselves up into knots to try to explain why that doesn't count. And then also too, using U.S. history as an example, and going along with, Ray playing or referring to this famous dialogue from Eccles and somebody else about, and the way our system works now, if people were to pay off all their debts, we'd have no money. And, so I will link to Mises.org. I have written some articles on this very issue. So I'll link to that if you want to see me elaborate further on this particular point about, is it true that right now the US dollar is in some sense debt-based? And there is a lot of truth there, right? That it is true right now that when a commercial bank in the United States grants somebody a mortgage, for example, they are effectively creating more money. If you define it as checkable demand deposits with banks as part of the money supply, then yes, when banks grant loans, that is expanding the money supply. And yes, because those new dollars come into existence through the accounting, bookkeeping operations of the bank extending credit, then yeah, for you to get an extra $10,000 in your checking account because you borrowed it from the bank, that extra $10,000 in money now corresponds to your liability, that you owe the bank an extra $10,000 than you did before the loan made those dollars come into existence. And that if you paid off the loan to reduce your debt to the bank, the very act of you doing that would shrink the quantity of dollars if you're talking about like M1 or M2, higher aggregates. That's true. All right. And it's also true that the base money, the reserves that the commercial banks hold with the Fed, can also be construed as debt. That's true. All right. So I understand if we were just talking about the US today, I wouldn't have such a problem with people saying, oh yeah, it's debt-based money. And if everybody paid all their debts off, we'd have no money. I don't, that strictly speaking wouldn't be true. Like, and I've proven that. I'll link to it, folks, if you want. Elsewhere, I went through the numbers and just looked at like the actual Fed's balance sheet and everything just to show it is not true. If everybody in the United States paid off all their debts right now, there would still be dollars that existed. But put that aside, it clearly wasn't true back on the days of the gold standard or gold and or silver, right? So the US dollar originally was defined as a certain number of grains or silver, of gold or silver, right? There were different numbers because gold and silver had different market values. All right. So that originally, that it wasn't that the dollar was backed up by gold or silver in the vault. It was the dollar was literally defined as such. And so like in the year 1810, if somebody had a chunk of gold, they could go in and have it turned into a $20 double eagle coin. Right. So it wasn't that the monetary authorities decided upon the money stock or the money supply and then made sure they had enough gold and silver in the vaults to back it up based on no. It was endogenous, if you know what that term means, that the public could come in and turn in raw gold and silver and have it stamped into the appropriate U.S. coinage that was fully, the legal real deal. That was official U.S. coinage, all right? So that's so foreign to us now that's why I stress that element so often, all right? And if you did that, if you had a chunk of gold and you went and you had it stamped and turned into a coin and it was the full body deal, that wasn't anybody's debt. It wasn't the U.S. government owed somebody $20. No, that coin was the $20. That's what it was. It was a certain weight of gold. So it was, the whole thing was in your hand. Right? Just like if you have the private keys or whatever, and you, in a sense, have some Bitcoins that you have control over, it's not that somebody owes you something. No, it is what it is. That's it. Okay. Also, Andrew Jackson famously paid off the federal debt. He didn't just run a budget surplus. He ran such large surpluses that he literally extinguished the federal debt. He also killed the Bank of the United States. All right, so hard money types can look to Andrew Jackson as showing, wow, what you can do. He did not interact so well with the Native Americans, but in any event, that's showing. So was it the case that briefly after Andrew Jackson paid off the federal debt, there were no more dollars in existence and Americans had to switch to paying with beaver skins or something? No, there were still dollars, because again, it is not true to say the US dollar was a creation of debt issuance or something, like, and all money corresponds to debt. That's just not a true statement. All right. Again, in modern times with modern fiat money and commercial banking and how all that works and fractional reserves, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, you could argue a large percentage of the existing money stock, especially if you're looking at the broader aggregates like M1, M2, and so on. You could argue a lot of that does have a mirror image of debt somewhere in the system. And that if people were to aggressively pay off those debts, the quantity of money would shrink. It wouldn't go to zero, though, even in our modern system, but I can understand. But again, that's just the way the system works right now. It's not that historically that was always true, whether that's just a feature of money per se. It's a feature of the current type of system we have in place. Okay, so now that we're warmed up with those things, let's go and look at two specific examples that Ray goes through where, to me, it's just crystal clear that what I would call his faulty theoretical MMT framework is just leading him to completely misinterpret the historical record. And I'm going to give you two clear-cut examples. Okay, so this first one has to do with the American colonies, but I'm going to play a little bit of the clip earlier just so you understand the context and what point he's trying to make.
And finally, taxes drive money. Taxes are what gives value its money. It is the power to impose taxes that is the important sovereign power that ensures the currency has value. I'll say more about this too. Okay, you don't have to take my word for it. You can take the written records at the time. Okay, let's look at the colony of Virginia. The colonies were not allowed to coin. The colonies had to use the crown's coins. Okay, the colonies were always short of money in order to hire the armies to fight the Indians and the French Canadians. So they started issuing paper monies. Okay, paper money was created and directly spent by the legislature. Every paper money included a new tax. Okay. So when they passed a law to authorize printing 10,000 pounds, Virginia pounds, they also imposed a tax that they expected would raise 10,000 pounds. They imposed the tax the same time that they issued the notes. Now, why would they impose a tax? Because it created a demand for those notes. The colonial regular people had severe shortage of coins too. They couldn't have paid the new tax with the coins. There's not enough. Now, they were allowed to pay taxes with coins. Of course, the Virginia colonial government was glad to have the coins, okay? But they typically paid most of the tax in the form of notes. When the colonial legislature received the tax revenue, what did they do with it? They burned it. They did not spend their tax revenue. They burned it. So as the notes come in, they burn them. What did the King of England do when the tally sticks came in tax payments? Burned them. You always burn your tax revenue. You do not spend tax revenue, you burn it. In fact, they finally outlawed the use of tally sticks in England in around 1840. All the tally sticks were brought in, and the people at the Exchequer, which is the Treasury, the IRS, they were so glad they didn't have to use tally sticks anymore, matching them. They threw them all into the stoves at the same time, and they burned down Parliament. There's a very famous painting of Parliament burning down. It's because they burned the tally sticks. Okay, anyway. The revenues received were burned. The notes that were not received remained out and were used in the markets and actually were preferred over the coins. People preferred to use the notes rather than the coins. Okay, the taxes were paid in notes or specie. About 3/4 of the taxes were paid with notes and 1/4 were paid with the coins. This tax that was imposed by the legislature when they issued the notes was called a redemption tax. It was called a redemption tax. Okay, that's written right into the law. They knew what they were doing. The purpose of the tax is to redeem the notes. It gives a demand for the notes, and then the notes are brought back and burned. That prevents them from causing inflation. The purpose of the tax was to get most of the notes out so there wouldn't be any inflation. Adam Smith, 1776, wrote about this. He said, there's this strange thing going on in the colonies. They're issuing paper money, but it retains its value as long as they don't issue too much of it. Okay? So you use the taxes to make sure they don't stay out there and cause inflation.
Okay. So just to make sure you understand, part of the, what's the impact of this? Who cares? What's the news you can use? Why are we fighting over these issues so much? Because, and Ray says this elsewhere in this lecture, I'm not going to play the clip for you, but he does acknowledge, he says, the reasons it's so important for these hard money types, I don't know if he refers to Austrians specifically, with their cherished, origin of money story where they want it to be a spontaneous emergence from barter that doesn't involve the state. He says the reason they cling to what he believes is this discredited account is that they don't like the government. They want to be able to tell, an immaculate origin story of money that doesn't involve dirty politics because these Austrian types, they don't like the government. And so, they would be in trouble if they had to acknowledge that, if we're going to have money, we kind of have to have a government, right? So that's his view. But I'm going to go the other way and say, likewise, when I'm trying to understand why are the MMTers so enamored with this theory that, what gives money its purchasing power is taxation, is because they're so enthralled to the idea of raw government power. It excites them, gives them a thrill up their leg. And so the idea that just the taxation power of the sovereign state can give money value, I think they like that, and it helps to bolster the grandeur and impressiveness of the state. as this institution without which humanity would be helpless. And so, put that aside. We don't need to psychoanalyze each other. It doesn't matter what the motivation is. I'm going to show you he's wrong historically, but I'm just trying to explain, why are we arguing over this point? And that's partly why, because it is important for the rest of our theoretical frameworks. Okay, so in any event, when it comes to the Virginia story, I'm trying to get this guy on the podcast, but he hasn't gotten back to me yet, so I don't know if that's going to happen. But I found an interesting article on this particular episode. And so the big picture here is that the Virginia legislature at times would want to spend more than they could raise through taxation in that time period. And so in a sense, they wanted to draw on future tax revenue, right? They wanted to pull it forward, was the way that this economist was explaining it. And Wray is correct that they were smart, right? That the people who were crafting this legislation and issuing these treasury notes in order to raise funds in the present that they could spend for a military campaign or whatnot, and then sort of spread the cost over several years into the future. They knew enough of economics to realize that, to make this credible, we have to convince the public that don't worry, we're going to withdraw these notes, that we have a mechanism in place. And so that is all true. But the thing that Wray did not emphasize there that's important to the story is that Wray would have you believe that it was merely the necessity of paying taxes, one option of which was to use these government-issued notes as the mechanism, and that alone is what gave them their value, right? That the government said, hey, we're going to levy this new tax of a certain amount per person per year, whatnot, and you have to have these notes in order to satisfy your tax obligation. Or if you want to pay us in specie, which the gold and silver official coins, you can do that too. But, we know we're out here in Virginia. We're not over in London or something. And it's hard to come by precious metal coins. And so, yes, if you're doing work or you're selling chickens to somebody and they want to pay you with these Virginia legislature issued treasury notes that have a certain face value, then yeah, you can be comfortable in doing that and say, why would I sell my chickens for these pieces of paper that the Virginia legislature issued instead of, for real money, gold and silver coins? Well, you might, because when tax time comes around, you're going to have to give the taxman either a bunch of coins or these pieces of paper will also suffice. And so that's why, the legislature's taxation imbues them with value, and that's why they would circulate in the community and have purchasing power, right? That's the MMT story. Just like that's where money gets its value from, ultimately, is from the government's taxation power. Okay, so again, that's just historically wrong. I've shown examples, right? Again, that's why I was saying the POW camp, it wasn't the German guards first said, hey, every Tuesday, each prisoner has to give us one cigarette or else we're going to beat you up. And then the prisoner's like, oh, what do we do? Oh, geez, I gotta scramble, get some cigarettes. Here, can I shine your shoes? Here, can I trade my ham for your cigarettes? Because I don't want to get beaten up by the German guard next week. That's not what happened at all. These cigarettes were valuable as a regular commodity, and then because of their characteristics, they emerged to be the commonly accepted medium of exchange, right? And so here we can see that Wray's story does not hold up. So you need to just know a little bit more about the mechanics of it. So again, the Virginia legislature, they want to spend a bunch of money. They know that this year's tax receipts are not going to cover it. So they float bond, treasury certificates, debt instruments. And what they did is the face value of the bond said it's sometime in the future, whatever it was, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, this has a certain face value. And at that time, the legislature will redeem this piece of paper at the face value with specie. Does everyone get that? So it was a bond that was backed up by real coinage, full body coins. And so that's why investors would lend money to the government today when they issued the notes at a discount, right? You wouldn't pay 10 pounds today for a note that said 5 years from now, you're going to get 10 pounds worth of, coins that would circulate in England. Why would you do that? You'd want to earn interest. Just like in our times, in case I'm losing anybody, right? Right now, that's what's called a zero coupon bond. If the Treasury issues a bond that says, note that says 12 months from now, the bearer of this gets $1,000 from the U.S. Treasury, and they issue this today, the person buying it at auction is not going to pay $1,000 for that, because then they would be earning a 0% nominal interest rate. You're only going to pay $995 for it, so that you earn $5 in interest on your $995 principal. Okay. So that's the way it worked. The notes sold, they were originally issued at a discount to their face value, and then later they were redeemed at the full face value. Okay. So that's how it worked. And so what would happen, and I'm not going to read it to you, but there was specific language in the legislation authorizing this note issue to reassure the members of the public, and said this, so Wray talked about how they would institute redemption taxes, right? But Wray led you to believe that the entire process, the whole mechanism was, they issue 1,000 units of 1,000 of these notes. And then if they want to retire it over the course of 10 years, each year they tax on net 100 of the notes and then burn it, so that after the 10 years, all the notes are gone. And that's what if you just listen to Wray's exposition, that's what you would think is how it worked. But that's not how it worked. That, yes, all along the way, people could pay with the notes if they wanted to, but they could also pay with the coins. And Wray did mention that. But then any coins that were paid had to be put into a fund, so that at the end, any notes that had yet to be redeemed, that people hadn't used to pay their tax obligations along the way, any notes outstanding, then upon the maturity date would be turned in, and then the coins that had accumulated over time from people paying their tax obligations, not with the notes, but with actual coinage, then that would be used to satisfy those bondholders upon redemption, at redemption time, upon maturity. Okay? And so those are two different ways of understanding what it is. And if it's the latter, if that's really what's driving it, that the reason the public was holding these notes was because they thought, this is a promise of the government that we're going to pay you in real money down the road, commodity money, gold and silver, coins, then, the MMT story has nothing to do with this. That's just standard. Yeah. People valued commodity money for the reason, Carl Menger said. And then the government, if it wants to spend more money today than it has available from its current income, it can borrow money by issuing promises to pay more real money down the road. There's nothing mysterious about that. Okay. And so there's a section in this guy's paper that, to me, really cinched or clinched it, I should say, the case to show it was the latter process that was giving these things their purchasing power in the community. Okay. And so he's got this section paper called The John Robinson Scandal at the Treasury. In the sub-period of 1763 through 1765, and he's got references to his notation from his empirical calculations, and he just shows that basically the risk premium or the discount rate on the circulating notes increased. Okay, so the deal is, I'm sorry, I should have given you more frame for jumping into this excerpt from the paper. So just like a zero coupon bond, right? If you got a bond from the Treasury that says in the year 2030, the holder of this certificate will be paid $10,000 from the U.S. Treasury, and so assume it's zero coupon. There's, nothing's going on to that. So right now, that's not going to have a market value of $10,000. It's going to be a discount. But with the passage of time, is the year 2030 approaches, the market value of that piece of paper is going to go up, assuming the creditworthiness of the government doesn't change in the meantime, right? It's just as the time gets closer and closer, the market value is going to approach the face value, and then boom, on the maturity date, it's going to be exactly equal to $10,000 because that's what you're going to get paid for it, right? So the same thing happened with these Virginia Treasury notes, that they had a face value that was at par, defined in terms of tobacco. Incidentally, that's another thing too. It was defined in terms of units of tobacco, which, again, just showing all these examples the MMTers point to about how the state with all its might can come in and just declare something to be money because they can tax. Even they're denominated in like shekels of silver, or here amounts of, physical weights of tobacco, which is, it's interesting that it always comes back to commodities when, according to the MMT story, there's no reason it needs to. It could just be, in Satoshis or something, right? But no, it's always denominated in actual commodities. So in any event, which to me underscores that Menger's story is correct and Wray's is wrong. But anyway, so these notes, based on the maturity date, would increase in their market value. So yes, they were used in day-to-day transaction. You could call them money, but the point was the purchasing power of a given note would be higher if the redemption date was closer for a given face value. Okay? And then what this economist did in his paper here, like that's his contribution. He gave a little bit of the history just to motivate it, but then, the bells and whistles of this guy's econometric article was to do a regression type analysis on this stuff to try to tease out the different influences, because you have empirical measurements to show what was the implicit discount rate on these things over time. And so what he found was, there's this one period where it looks like something screwy is happening, where the actual market value of these circulating treasury notes that the Virginia legislature had issued dropped relative to what you would have expected given how close the redemption date was. It seemed like they were trading at a bigger discount than they had earlier based on, normal processes of valuing a bond. Okay. And so why is that? Well, let's read. You might have thought, is it because they were worried that the Virginia legislature might not tax them in the future? I was like, oh no, if they stop taxing us, well then why would these things have value? No, that's not what it was. Let's read. Okay. So this period where, again, the implicit discount rate increased on these things. This period is associated with a financial crisis that preoccupied Virginia politics. John Robinson, treasurer and speaker of the House from 1738 until his death in early 1766, had been suspected of diverting funds accumulating in the treasury, funds earmarked for redeeming notes at their end maturity dates. And again, you call them funds, but this was actual money, right? This wasn't pieces of paper. He loaned these funds without specific authority to do so to his friends. In 1766, after his death, it was discovered that just over 95,000 Virginia pounds of these funds had been so diverted. Given the large amount diverted, the suspicions expressed at the time that such was happening seemed credible. The evidence in figure, so he had charts with his figure 1, is consistent with the public becoming suspicious of improprieties around 1761, judging by the shrinking premium that starts after 1760, right? And so he's referring to the specific econometric variables in his analysis. Okay. Given that a substantial amount of notes in circulation in the early 1760s had their end maturity dates between 1765 and 1769, the public had to be concerned in the early 1760s that the accumulating tax funds in the Treasury earmarked to redeem these notes would not be there when so required for redemption. A letter in the Virginia Gazette dated October 17th, 1766 remarked that, quote, "Many of us, to our great detriment, have had money paid to us whose day of redemption was elapsed, in which some of our creditors refused to receive from us again, alleging it was no currency. This money, when carried to the treasury, has frequently been refused to be redeemed under the pretense that the treasury was empty. So, end quote. This is back to the Economist in this paper. Fear of delayed redemption led the public to eliminate any of this margin and then to add a positive amount to the notes by 1763. Okay? So, again, in case you're getting lost in the weeds here, as I just clearly read to you there, the concern was, oh, wait a minute, because all along the way, right, they issued these notes that were going to pay a certain amount at the end of the time period upon maturity. And if people along the way paid their tax obligations in the notes, then yep, Ray is correct. The government would just take it and burn them. But for those notes that were still circulating in the community, that, you know, were being used as money, if the tax obligations were paid for this particular tax that was calibrated to make sure they brought it enough to, you know, retire these notes, if somebody ever paid their tax obligation in actual specie, the Virginia legislature couldn't take that and go spend it on something else. No, they had to put it in the treasury and save it because, hey, we instituted this tax is specifically earmarked to retire this outstanding treasury note issue. And so, yep, if somebody pays us with the notes, we just burn it, great. But if somebody doesn't pay us with a note, if they pay us with actual coinage, specie, we got to hang on to that because the whole point of this tax was to reassure the public that these notes are going to be redeemed, that we're good for it, right? And so when it was discovered that the treasurer had actually, unbeknownst to the public, and you know he didn't have authorization to do this, he just did it, had been taking those coins and lending them out to his buddies, so that we have these outstanding treasury notes in the public's hands, and there's not enough in the treasury right now to redeem these. And as the date's getting closer for when these things are supposed to mature, and we should turn them in and get the specie for it, now as the public starts to wonder, is that going to happen? The notes trade at a bigger discount, right? And then I read that excerpt to you. So again, whose story is right as to what gave these pieces of paper their value? Is it the Austrians or the MMTers? There was nothing in there about, the public became concerned that what if in a fit of mercy, the Virginia legislature declared a tax holiday for 3 years. Then the public wondered, well, no, if there's the government's not sucking these things out of circulation, won't they lose their purchasing power, right? You could tell a story like that, but that's not what the scandal was. That's not what the fear was. The fear was, we were holding these things because they were promises to be redeemed in precious metals, and now we're not sure they're going to be able to honor that promise, right? So it was, the Virginia legislature was functioning just like a standard bank under a hard money standard, where the bank can issue certificates that are, claims saying, if you show up at our branch and present this claim, we have gold or silver in the vault that we'll give you upon demand. That's what banknotes were back in the days of so-called free banking. Okay, so that's what the Virginia legislature do. And that's also why when Ray makes the offhand remark in there that, the public preferred to use these notes, it's because, for the same reason that you might want to use a checking account with a debit card or writing personal checks rather than just carrying around a bunch of $100 bills on you, right? That the public thought that these notes were fully backed, or that there was mechanisms in place so that they would be fully backed. And that's why they were trading, because it was more convenient, right? And the paper even gets into, I won't read it in the interest of time here, but the paper does get into, there were cases where the notes, even after the redemption date, continued to circulate in the community, right? So like you had the ability, you could have turned it in to get the face value of coinage, and they just held them because at that point they had just turned into 100% backed notes, demand deposits, as it were, held at the local, the Virginia Treasury. And so they circulate in the community because the merchants thought, the Virginia legislature is good for it. We can just go turn this in to the Treasury. Okay. All right. So I'll stop with that one. Now, for the remainder of today's episode, let's focus on a fascinating example from monetary history. And yes, it is monetary history, and you'll see why I'm stressing that. Before I dive into the Wray's exposition or treatment of this episode, let me reverse things. Let me show you how others talk about this, because it's going to highlight something about Wray's treatment. Okay, so specifically, what we are talking about is the Yap Islanders, YAP. And there was a book that was written about their, what was called stone money. Okay, and the idea was these islanders had these huge, well, they didn't need to be. In some cases, they were huge stones, like taller than a man, and they were circular, and they had holes bored into the middle of them, presumably to make it easier to, put like logs or something through there to move them, to roll them around, to get them into place. And that was, many economists thought, a form of money that these people had. Okay. And so let me just read from a few different excerpts. So I found this Medium article on it, and partly what's interesting is the Yapese, right? So the people who lived on Yap are called the Yapese. It wasn't local. They had to go a long way away over the ocean to get the source of this very special. It was apparently, if they polished it right and everything, it was a very beautiful stone, right? So that's partly why they liked it. It wasn't just some grungy rock. It was, if they polished it and everything, it was this almost like glowed white or something in the sunlight. Okay, so that's why they liked these things. But it was far away, and there was interesting things where even if there's cases where these guys would have it on their raft and they'd be coming back, and then a storm would hit and the stone would fall to the bottom of the ocean, but the men would survive and make it back to their village and just say, no, trust us, we had a stone that was this big or whatever, and it's this guy's. And so now his family owned that. And it was just, people remembered for generations thereafter that family owns that huge circular stone that's at the bottom of the ocean. Okay, so you can see why economists like this story. Okay, but anyway, let me just read from this excerpt. Being so valuable, the Wray, R-A-I, that's what they call these stones, couldn't be used for everyday transactions. For those, the Yapese would exchange pearl shells or woven mats, or barter with coconut meat, taro, or cups of syrup. Instead, the gleaming rocks were exchanged to cement alliances between chiefs battling rival tribes. They could be gifted in a dowry, exchanged for land or fishing rights, or used to settle a debt if you fell into dire straits. For example, if a member of your family killed a neighbor's relative, the following conversation could occur. Your brother killed my cousin. I demand your brother's life in exchange. No, I love my brother. It's not his fault. What if I give you all my wealth instead? Okay, instead I'll be rich now. Right. So this author is being a bit colloquial, but I'm just trying to underscore that's, these they're like, it would be like as if they were large gold bars, right? So you're not going to go down and buy a cup of coffee with a huge gold bar, but major purchase, you're buying big tracts of land, or again, your daughter's getting married, and so maybe you'd go ahead and give that as a dowry, whatnot, right? That sort of thing. Okay. Now there was an interesting quirk. So now we've established that, and this is all in the book that some, I don't know if anthropologist is the right word, but some guy in like the late 1800s, early 1900s wrote this book, and that's talking about these experiences with these people. Okay, because he visited, and then he in particular tells this story about what happened when the Germans occupied them. Okay, so I'll go ahead and play a clip I found. This is on the NPR's Planet Money show that this was from 2010, this particular episode, late 2010 is when this thing. So the title of this was The Friday Podcast, A Giant Stone Coin at the Bottom of the Sea. Okay. as they go through it. So let me just play an excerpt here so you can hear about this episode involving the Germans.
If we haven't quite blown your mind yet, consider this story from that book, The Island of Stone Money.
Yeah, so the book tells this great story. It was around 1900, and Germany had control of Yap. And the Germans, being Germans, decided they wanted some really good roads built. And the Yappies had these paths that they thought were totally fine. But the Germans said, no, we would like you to build some real roads. And the Yappies said, no, what we have is fine.
So the Germans decide they're going to fine the chiefs unless the work gets done.
But that's a problem, right? Because you're going to fine them in their local currency, which are the big stone pieces of money. You're going to take them away? And what are you going to do with them? They're not good in Germany.
And it would be a huge hassle to do anything with them. And the book even says the Germans wouldn't even have had room for the stone money in their colonial buildings on the island. So after thinking about it for a while, the Germans get an idea. They decide they're going to go around and paint black crosses on some of the big pieces of stone money. And they'll tell everybody that a black cross meant the stone was now owned by the government. And so, okay, here I'm going to read from the book again. He says, this instantly worked like a charm. The people, thus dolefully impoverished, turned to and repaired the highways to such good effect from one end of the island to the other that they're now like park drives.
And then the end of the story is that the Germans go around and they scrub off the X's and they're returned to the chiefs.
Okay, so there's that. And then that was familiar to me when I heard that. And then I realized, oh yeah, because Milton Friedman talked about that in one of the first economics books that I read when I was in high school. I got into economics and I was reading stuff, and I went to a local bookstore and I looked up, I had heard of Milton Friedman at that point, and and he had this book called Money Mischief. And so it was a collection of his essays, and one of them was this one that I'm going to read some portions of for you right now. And it was called The Island of Stone Money by Friedman. So he originally wrote this for the Hoover Institution in 1991. Okay? And so he starts and gives he calls it The Island of Stone Money. From 1899 to 1919, the Caroline Islands in Micronesia were a German colony. The most westerly of the group is the island of Yap, which at the time had a population of 5,000 to 6,000. In 1903, an American anthropologist by the name of William Henry Furness III spent several months on the island and wrote a fascinating book about the habits and customs of its inhabitants. He was particularly impressed by the islanders' monetary system and accordingly gave his book the title I've given this chapter, namely The Island of Stone Money. Okay, so this guy, Friedman is saying he's an anthropologist. William Henry Furness III, the book he wrote about these people that was published in 1910 was called The Island of Stone Money, right? So he thinks it's money. Friedman thinks it's money. Okay, so they go ahead and talk about it. And I won't read it here, but in Friedman's excerpt from this book, you can see that part about the, this instantly worked like a charm. The people, thus dolefully impoverished, turned to and repaired the highways to such good effect from one end of the island to the other that they are now like park drivers. Then the government dispatched its agents and erased the crosses. Presto, the fine was paid. The happy fellows resumed possession of their capital stock and rolled in wealth. Okay, so that was in the original book, The Island of Stone Money, that this anthropologist had written, originally in 1910. That's where that came from. Okay, so let me just read a little bit from Friedman and his reaction to this, because this is kind of famous that among economists, they've heard of this story, and probably they heard it from this paper by Friedman. So this is Friedman talking. Unless you're very unusual, your immediate reaction, like my own, will be, well, how silly. How can people be so illogical? However, so he's saying you might want to criticize the Yap. Like, that's kind of weird that just because the Germans drew some crosses on your stones, all of a sudden you're like, oh, and then you went and built all the roads for them that they wanted, and then they just erased the crosses, and then they're, oh, we're rich again. Like, in Friedman saying, you might think that that's kind of irrational on the part of these islanders. However, before criticizing too severely the innocent people on Yap, it's worth contemplating an episode in the U.S. to which they might well have your reaction. In 1922 to 33, the Bank of France feared that the U.S. would not stick to the gold standard, the traditional price of $20.67 an ounce of gold, and they were right to so fear. Accordingly, it asked the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to convert dollar assets that it had in the U.S. into gold To avoid the necessity of shipping the gold across the ocean, it requested the Federal Reserve Bank simply to store the gold on the Bank of France's account. In response, officials of the Federal Reserve Bank went to their gold vault, put in separate drawers the correct amount of gold ingots, and put a label or a mark on these drawers indicating that they were property of the French. For all it matters, they could have done so by marking them with a cross in black paint, just as Germans did to the stones. The result was headlines in the financial newspapers about, quote, the loss of gold, the threat to the American financial system, and the like. U.S. gold reserves were down, French gold reserves up. The markets regarded the U.S. dollar as weaker and the French franc as stronger. The so-called drain of gold by France from the United States was one of the factors that ultimately led to the banking panic of 1933. And this is the punchline, Friedman says. Is there really a difference between the Federal Reserve Banks believing that it was in a weaker monetary position because of some marks on drawers in its basement, and the Yap Islanders believed that they were poor because of some marks on their stone money? Or between the Bank of France's belief that it was in a stronger monetary position because of some marks on drawers in a basement more than 3,000 miles away, and the Yap Islanders' conviction that he was rich because of a stone under the water some 100 or so miles away, referring to when the stone fell off the raft on the way back home 100 miles away and it's at the bottom of the ocean, but yet he's still, hey, that's my property, even though we can't get to it. Or for that matter, how many of us have literal personal direct assurance of the existence of most of the items we regard as constituting our wealth? Entries in a bank account, properties certified by pieces of paper called shares of stocks, and so on and so on. Okay, so that's how Friedman dealt with that episode. That, he was saying, at first, this sounds hilarious to us. It's obviously a great story that the Germans just put some black crosses and then the people go do all this stuff and then they erase them and now people think they're rich again. But in Friedman's point is, if you think that's crazy, well, that's kind of like what our own monetary system, at least the gold-backed currencies, in his mind. Okay, so whatever you think of Friedman's analysis, whether you think he's spot on or what, it doesn't matter for our purposes today. I went through that somewhat laboriously because I wanted to show you how it was described in the original, anthropological book explaining these people, and the title they gave to that was The Island of Stone Money, how the NPR people handled it, and how Friedman handled it. Okay? And so now that you know that context, imagine that all you knew about the Yap Islanders and these stones came from Randall Wray, who was supposed to be a monetary expert who's going to give us the real insights, not what these ideologues and other economic buffoons are trying to do when they pull one over on you. Okay, so let's listen to how Randall Wray, when he's talking to these, I think they were undergrads, explains this episode.
Another example. This one's a little bit different. Okay, this is the Yap Islands, and economists use this as an example all the time of primitive people using money that is a commodity. So they decided to use these stone wheels as money to reduce the transactions costs of barter. Nobody's laughing. Here's how tall they are. Here's their coin. Okay. When you want to go to the market to buy a fat pig, you have to get 10 strong guys. You put a log through here, you pick it up, and you carry it to the market and you buy a pig. That reduced the transactions costs. Okay. It turns out on the Yap Islands, they don't have any stones like this. They have to get their dugout canoes, they paddle across open ocean 200 miles to go get the stone. They carve it, they put it on the canoe, and they try to paddle back. And a lot of the stones, the canoe flips over and they end up on the bottom of the ocean. But when the Yap Islanders consider their wealth of stones, they include all the ones that fell on the bottom because it doesn't matter. They know they still have them. I mean, they don't have them on the island, but they know where they are, more or less. They can't get them, but it doesn't matter. Okay? So anyway, economists wrote this up as, this is primitive money. Okay. They don't tell you the second part of the story. So the Germans are trying to colonize the Yap Islands. The Germans want some roads built. So they go to the island, and they say, hey, we need the road built. We'll pay you currency to build the road. And I don't know what the German currency then was, but let's say it's the mark. We'll pay you 5 marks an hour to build the road. The Yap Islanders look at them like they're crazy. Say, you want me to work for pieces of paper? And of course, the Germans look at them like they're crazy. You guys are so lazy, you won't even work for money. Okay? So they wouldn't work for the German currency. So some bright colonial governor said, I know what we'll do. Go through with a can of black paint and paint a big X on about half of the stones. So that's what they did. So they go through, they paint a black X. And the islanders say, what's going on? I say, well, we tax those. Okay, those are ours now. And they say, how can we get them back? I say, well, you can build a road. So they reversed the sequence, but the tax turned these into money. They were not money before. They were what we call primitive valuables. All tribal society has primitive valuables. They're usually things that are completely useless, and that's on purpose. And then they attach great ceremonial value to them. Okay? So this is a typical tribal thing that Europeans could not conceive of, so they thought they must be money. But they were turned into money only by a tax that the colonial government put on them.
Notice how he said, what the economists don't tell you, when no, that's not correct. That's partly why I went through that laboriously to show you that the economists are certainly not hiding that part. It's a great story that they're going to, of course, they're going to incorporate that if they have time. Now, maybe what Wray has in mind when he's saying that, assuming that there is something that he actually encountered that led him to say that, is I can imagine if in some textbook or whatever, some popular exposition about money, an orthodox economist said something like, throughout history, many items have served as money, ranging from, shells to cows or cattle to blah, 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 to tobacco, to even, in one case, giant stone discs. But what is common thread through all this is blah, blah, and they go on, so they don't take the time, if they're given this broad historical survey of different types of commodity monies, they might not then go on a tangent to talk about the German episode of building the roads. Okay, fine. But you can see what I'm saying. It's not that economists are embarrassed and they don't want people to know about the German market. No. Again, it's in Milton Friedman's popular book, Monetary Mischief or Money Mischief. And I'm sure 90% at least of any economist who has any idea, if you said, hey, do you know about the Yap and the island money? They would probably know that story because that's probably how they heard it, was through Friedman. Okay? So there's that element. But more fundamental than that is that Wray's story, or this episode, I should say, is the exact opposite of what Wray is telling you. Before I jump to that, let me just, you saw how the different accounts were saying the islanders viewed these things as significant items of wealth that could be exchanged, in transactions that involve large sums. Okay, so yes, it wasn't that some guy gives you 3 fish and then you'd give him one of these stones. That's just because it wouldn't work. Okay, but you saw that. So for Wray just to be saying, oh no, it's not money, I mean, he has to say that, right? Because his story is money only has value because of taxation. And there was nothing in the story before the Germans came on the scene about these stones being taxed by anybody. Okay. There actually, I'm not going to get into it, but there actually was some element about when I went and read all the background of this, that the elders did say if you went on an expedition and came back with one of these stones, that they were entitled to some of it, but put that aside. Okay. Wray is at least acknowledging that, yeah, the reason they liked these stones was because they were pretty to look at and they were impressive and whatever. And there were other characteristics people might have liked. Okay. But so I'm saying it's already, he's on shaky ground when he's just dismissing, oh, that's not money. It was just ceremony. that's ignoring the anthropological evidence to the contrary. But okay, put that aside. More fundamentally, what is crystal clear is Ray's story about how these things became valuable is exactly backwards, right? If Ray's story were true, it would have to look something like this. The Germans came over, they became the colonial overlords. They said to the local population of the, Yapese, hey, we want you to build these roads. And they said no. And then they said, okay, well, what if we paid you in marks? And they said, no, we don't use that. I said, okay. What if we paid you in these giant stone discs? And the people said, I don't like stone discs. What the heck am I going to do with a stone disc? No. And then the Germans said, oh, that's interesting. You say that because 6 months from now, we're going to require that the head of every household in your village gives us one of these stone discs, or we're going to shoot your firstborn child. What do you think of that? And then they said, oh, yeah, where do you want the road? Well, sure thing. Do you got any tar? Okay, so that would fit the MMT story, where the islanders originally did not value the stones, and the only reason they began to value them was because they knew, we're going to have this tax levied on us, and the Germans are saying, we'll accept the stones in payment, and so that's why we'll value these things. Okay, that is not at all what happened. Clearly, what happened, according to all accounts, including Ray's, is that the islanders valued the stones before the Germans even showed up. The Germans showed up. They wanted them to do something for them. They said no, and so they stole their wealth and said, we will only give this back to you if you do what we want. And so then the islanders did what they wanted, and they gave them back what the islanders originally valued, right? If Ray's story about how money derives its value were correct, when the Germans went around and put black X's or crosses on the stones, the islanders should have said, and said, hey, you better go build the roads, or we're not going to erase those X's or those crosses. The islanders would have said, well, I don't care. We don't like those stones, right? You see something? Those were not attacks if the islanders didn't already value them, right? So just think of it this way. Suppose the IRS came up to you in our day, and they went up and you had in your lawn, some rocks that, for like around the shrubs or whatever, just for decorative purposes. You had some stone, and the IRS came up and they spray painted some crosses on the rocks on your lawn. And they came up to you and they said, hey, a new policy. Come April 15th, we're not taking US dollars from you anymore. But if you don't give us a big share of the output you produce for your employer, we're not going to take those spray painted marks off your stones. And then you would ask for clarification. Hang on, you're saying I get to keep, any dollars my employer gives me, you're saying I get to keep those free and clear. But if I don't go serve in the military for you, or if I don't help you build a bridge, or if I don't go volunteer for, picking up litter at the park, you're saying the marks, the paint you just put on the stones on my lawn, you're not going to take that off? And I say, yep. And we're serious. Don't screw around. Those marks are staying on your rocks unless you give us 35% of your income in kind this year. And I think most of us would say, deal. And you wouldn't do it. Right? So, because by stipulation, you don't care that much about the rocks sitting on your lawn. Okay? But the islanders of Yap did care about those giant stone cylinder or discs. And so that's why when the Germans, and for whatever reason, they believe when the Germans defaced them, that meant they didn't own them anymore, that the Germans had seized control of them. And so that's why the islanders were willing to do labor in order to get the Germans to remove their lien against their property. Okay, so again, this isn't at all a story of the Germans taxing, and again, even on his own terms. Ray's saying, they weren't money until the taxation turned them into money. No, they weren't. But anyway, clearly what is happening is The stones were valuable to the Yapese before the Germans showed up. The Germans seized the property from them and then said, we will give this back to you if you do what we want. And that's what happened. So that is not at all an example of the Germans imbuing something that previously had been useless to them or valueless with purchasing power simply because it was a means to satisfy this external obligation that had been levied on them. It's not at all what happened. It was these things had value beforehand, and that's why the Germans, by seizing them, could then use them to pay the islanders to do what they wanted. Just as surely as if they showed up and grabbed a bunch of cattle and said, do what we want and we'll give you your cattle back. That wouldn't show that, oh yes, the cattle were valueless until the Germans levied a tax. What are you talking about? Okay, so I think this episode just shows crystal clear how the MMTers, their faulty framework leads them to just look at a historical episode and say something that is clearly the opposite of what happened, and to draw literally the opposite conclusion of what you should have concluded from it. The last thing I'll say, just to wrap up, is, isn't it interesting too, in all of this discussion with Ray and everybody, he never said, oh, by the way, it kind of stinks that, these colonial powers come in and do this, right? It's kind of unfair that these German occupiers just stole all the family wealth from these various people and forced them to do a bunch of labor they didn't want to do and then gave them their wealth back. There was no tears shed there. Nothing about the horrors of colonialism from typical progressive left-winger on this issue, because no, the important thing here is look at the power of taxation, even though he was wrong about that, right? That when it comes to where does money get its purchasing power from, out goes sympathy for the villagers who are being oppressed by European colonial powers. No, in this case, it's, well, without taxation, who would build the roads? Okay, folks, I'll wrap it up there. Thanks for your attention. We'll see you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.